Hello, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. So this week, I wanted to talk about something that I see all the time and that I have experienced myself all the time, lots of the time as well. And that is illness anxiety. So I love this term. I feel like it's a newer term. Like when I went through medical school, I think we were still calling it more like somatic illness or like being a hypochondriac. I'm not sure exactly when it came into the lexicon, but I feel like I learned it a little bit later in my training, or even when I became a full physician. And so just to give you a definition of what I'm talking about, in terms of what, say, the DSM or what sort of the technical definition is, illness anxiety disorder, sometimes called hypochondriasis or health anxiety, is worrying excessively that you are or may become seriously ill. And I just love, because illness anxiety just captures that so well. You're anxious about being sick. You're anxious that you could be sick now, or you're anxious that you could become sick in the future. Has anyone in healthcare experienced a patient who had illness anxiety? That's such a silly question because I mean it's daily. I think it's daily. And it's both patients who also have underlying organic illness and then are anxious about that illness. And then there's also folks that we see that, as far as we can tell, as far as the tests tell us, there isn't actually anything there. And yet they are still so anxious about their illness and either are experiencing symptoms that we don't really understand their organic origin. And so we're wondering if actually what they're experiencing is the physical manifestations of their illness anxiety. But I'll also have patients who come in and they just have a lot of questions and they're like, I feel fine, but what about this? What about this? Could I get this? People who come in for a physical and they want to be just like screened for it. They're like, can I just have a full body scan in case I have cancer? Right. Like sometimes they're very aware. They're like, I just am so anxious that I might get sick. And so can you give me all the tests and all the things so I never get sick? Right. So, yeah. And I have personally found this phenomenon in my patient practice, because I practice family medicine, really challenging for me. In the past, even before I was aware that this is what I'm reacting to, I would just really perceive patients who had high levels of illness anxiety as like just really unpleasant encounters. I would perceive them as very demanding, very draining and exhausting, and really anxiety provoking. Hint, hint. I think that's what was really going on with all of it, right? I also did observe and continue to observe that illness anxiety has this major impact on our healthcare system. Like it leads to a lot of over investigating. It leads to frequently coming to see the doctor, leads to, therefore like high cost resources being used. Like a patient with very intense illness anxiety is like more likely to present to emergency room for symptoms that actually are not life-threatening, and there's so many dynamics going on there. And the emergency room is one of the most expensive places you can access in healthcare. And so, I mean, this is like a serious issue for our healthcare system, for us as practitioners, and most importantly, like for our patients. It is extremely unpleasant to live with illness anxiety. And yet I feel like we don't often have resources of how to like address it directly, which is fascinating. So yeah, I will say that just up front here at the beginning of this, we're going to talk about all the different ways that I have found useful to address illness anxiety with my patients. Because I think that we need to start talking about this more. And I want to, start a conversation and hear from all of you who are listening. Like, what is it that you do for patients with illness anxiety? What resources are you aware of? Because I feel like this is something that we could really be offering more support to our patients about. And so here are kind of the key skills that I have learned, honestly, mostly from my coaching training that I've done this year. And they have really helped me change how I approach my patients with illness anxiety. And I am starting to see that is actually producing different results in terms of how I approach illness anxiety with my patients, I have witnessed can allow them a space to have more insight into their own illness anxiety and change their experience of it as well. So the key skills that I have, there's sort of two buckets. So one is the skills of holding space for them to share their concerns and their fears and their anxieties without judgment, without defensiveness, without all the things that I used to think I'd have to do and that would leave me so drained, is how to really skillfully hold space for them. And when I say I hold space, I mean really listening to them. It doesn't have to be all day, doesn't have to be forever, but like the time we spend together, that is sort of the main framework I think of when I'm listening to them, is I'm holding space for them to unpack their illness anxiety and their experience of their fears, their experience of their symptoms, that is all connected to their illness anxiety. Okay, so that's sort of the first set of skills. And then the second set of skills is really setting firm boundaries around my time and my availability. So time being, time spent within one given patient encounter, my availability in terms of how many appointments I am willing to offer them, right? Because sometimes people with intense anxiety want to see you every day, right? So my availability in that way, and what I will and won't order for them. That's another, those boundary skills are actually very critical, not only for me, but also for the patient, and are therapeutic in terms of helping their illness anxiety to set sort of firm, compassionate boundaries around that. We do know, they've done studies that like ordering every test that a patient requests who has illness anxiety does not actually ultimately help their illness anxiety. Now, that isn't to say that we don't order any tests either, but I think sometimes we have this idea in our heads, like if I just keep ordering all their tests, at some point their anxiety is going to go away. I think it can sometimes produce temporary relief. And sometimes it is very therapeutic with a certain patient. You've reached a certain point and you're like, okay, we're going to order this test, probably going to come back negative, but I feel like this is good. But it's all in like how you order the test and why you're ordering the test. If you're ordering it because you're hoping that will solve their anxiety, that does not happen very often, right? Especially if they really have anxiety about any kind of illness, they're going to just keep asking for more. And so setting boundaries around being thoughtful about what tests you order, being thoughtful about the time you spend each visit and how many visits you offer. Those are the two like skill sets that I have found extremely useful for my patients with illness anxiety. And I give sort of workshops and do coaching about how to learn those skill sets. So I'm not going to get into all the details of how I can do that on this podcast. But the third thing that is a skill, it is a personal skill that is actually the most critical before you even think about holding space or setting firmer boundaries, is addressing my illness anxiety. Because before I addressed my own illness anxiety, it was impossible for me to consider holding space for them or setting boundaries with them, because I was too busy circling in my own head with my own illness anxiety. I thought it was my patient's illness anxiety that was causing my own, but I have come to understand that it was primarily my illness anxiety that was shaping my experience of theirs. So, and when I'm talking about illness anxiety, I am actually talking about my anxieties about getting sick myself. But in this context, I'm also talking more globally about our anxiety about humans getting sick. Like, it's this sort of funny thing. We go into medicine. So you think it's like we're aware and have come to a place of acceptance that people get sick. Because it's literally what we signed up for. You wouldn't sign up for a job that you think you wouldn't have any customers. Like, obviously people are going to get sick. They're going to come to us. But there's so many underlying factors that I'm going to talk about in a minute that lead us to personalize our patient's illness and take responsibility for our patient's illness in ways that make us anxious. And that's been a very useful thing to know, is that when I'm anxious about my patient's illness, that blocks me from being able to use my best skills to hold space and set boundaries, and everything else that I may learn is helpful for my patients with illness anxiety. So I'll give kind of this concrete example that I think illustrates the difference. I have patients who have reported symptoms and like real illness, and I don't feel any anxiety about them, even when they come to me and they report new symptoms or whatever. So one patient I can think of has the diagnosis of schizophrenia, and they will come and report all sorts of interesting experiences and interesting symptoms that they have. And because I know that patient and their context, even if they ask me like, what do you think, which product should I buy to cure, the alien living in my belly? That is actually not one of their delusions, but like it's actually similar tone to that. They ask me a lot of questions and ask my advice a lot about what kind of things they should buy to solve what they think is happening inside their body. I don't feel anxious about trying to answer those questions because I'm aware that like the whole reason they're asking those questions is because of their mental health condition. And I don't personalize, like I'm not going to have an answer. I know that my answer is immaterial, right? Because I know really the whole reason they're asking the questions is because of everything they have going on in their brain because of their condition that they have. So I feel very calm and connected. And I'm like, what do you think? And I'm not like thinking I'm supposed to have the answers for them. And so I'm not worried about those appointments. I don't perceive those to be anxious. Like I know also over time, this patient is at a level with their schizophrenia that's like stable. So I'm not like bringing any of my stuff. I'm just listening to them. I give them not like, I don't have answers, like I said, to their questions because I don't have a solution of like which body lotion will help remove aliens from your belly. I just actually don't have that information, but I don't make it mean anything about me because I'm aware of what's really happening in that room, which is the patient has fixed delusions. They come in every time, ask very similar questions, and they're very satisfied with whatever answer I give, including my favorite, which is, what do you think? And then they give some options. I'm like, well, which one of those sounds good to you? Like it's all actually for them to reflect for themselves. Versus someone else comes in that doesn't have that kind of context. And then they ask me about either they're asking me about symptoms that they're having, and that could indicate something serious or something totally benign. Classic is chest pain, right? People come with chest pain. You listen to the whole story. You're like, I think this is not cardiac, not lung. It sounds very not those things. It doesn't have those features, right? But it could be underneath. And they're anxious about that. It could be. And I'm thinking it's their anxiety about that it could be something serious that's making me anxious. But actually, it's because I'm not sure myself. But what if it could be, right? What if it could be cardiac and I'm missing it? What if I'm actually not a competent enough clinician in order to discern if it's cardiac or not, right? And it's that anxiety inside of me that is leading me to this demanding, draining, anxiety-provoking experience. It's about me, and particularly the inhuman story that I need to have the answers for this person in order to think of myself as a good doctor. It's all this pressure I'm putting on myself that they're asking me, because someone with illness anxiety is likely going to pepper you with questions. So that's like often it's like, what do you think it could be? Could it be this? Could it be this? Could it be this? And if you think that your job is to like, yes, no, and like answer all of those questions, woof, exhausting, right? If you think you're like in the middle of an oral exam, basically, versus witnessing, okay, there's physical things going on here, but also this patient clearly has illness anxiety from the way they're presenting, from how they're asking those questions. It's clear they are very nervous. If I feed into it by trying to answer all those questions, I'm actually not helping the patient, and I'm definitely not helping myself, right? And the reason I think I have to feed into it is because of my stuff and my belief system. And so that's the number one step. Do this first before you even think about trying to set a boundary or hold space, right? Like it's got to be first managing my illness anxiety and identifying the inhuman stories that are underneath that are leading me to think I'm supposed to show up in a certain way and putting pressure on myself to show up in a certain way. And the number one inhuman story I find with illness anxiety is that I think I have to have all the answers for this person, like I said. So why do we have this kind of illness anxiety? Why do we have illness anxiety in general as practitioners? I think a lot of reasons. So number one is we're human too. we often can get excessively worried about when we or our loved ones are ill, because again, we've seen the worst case scenarios come true. And that's same with our patients. Like, it all sounds fine, but if you've been practicing for more than a year, you've seen times where it all sounded fine, but then it ended up being not fine. And now you have that worry of like, am I going to miss something again? Am I going to miss it again? I heard, maybe it didn't even happen to you personally, but you've heard a story from a colleague. None of the red flags were there, and they ended up having a pulmonary embolism, whatever it is, right? We hear these stories and they start to feed into the ultimate story, really, that we can't trust ourselves. We can't trust our clinical assessment of the situation. That is what anxiety ultimately is the manifestation of us being unable to trust ourselves, by the way. So why we have it is because of these stories that we've heard from others or told ourselves of like, I can't trust that I am going to find the answer, and I need to know the answer. I need to know that I will find the answer. If I miss it, I am bad. Like, all this pressure we have on ourselves. And that's not something we did to ourselves. That's like all through through our culture. You hear stories of people being like, I went to the doctor and they totally missed the thing and it's their fault, right? Like we really like, there's the medical legal part where it's like, we get sued if we miss something, like all these things are real features of how our system work. Even things like just all of the messages we receive that our patients' health outcomes are under our complete control and responsibility, right? And I don't even think it's necessarily intentional, but some of the ways that we are, the messages we receive from our healthcare system really feed into this. Like, an example I always think of is, I get this like practice report once every 3 months that tells me like facts about my patients. And I think it's, actually like a thoughtful, it's probably like done in like a kind, supportive spirit. But when I have anxiety that I can't trust myself as a clinician, and I'm ultimately just an imposter, and everyone's going to find out that I'm a bad clinician, and then I read this report, and like one of the things on the report is like, how many of my patients are out of target for their diabetes, right? And I look at that report and I'm like, I'm a failure, because I think that my patient's A1C level is my responsibility. And I'm getting a report card that's telling me how badly I'm failing at making these patients' blood levels be different than they should. You see, and I hear that in other areas too, like different parts of the healthcare system and hospitals where they're sending you metrics about your performance and comparing them to other clinicians. And I think people think that that's going to be useful. And maybe it is if everyone doesn't have, this lack of self-trust and confidence underneath. But I think, since we're working with human brains and we kind of know how humans work, all that really does is make those that are already insecure and uncertain about their abilities as a clinician feel worse about themselves. That's what I really mean when I say illness anxiety, by the way. It's like anxiety about what our patient's illness means about us. And if you have that as your default setting of, I'm not good enough, I don't trust myself, then every time a patient presents and you don't have an immediate answer, boom, more evidence that you can't trust yourself. Every time you have someone come in and you think it's one thing and then it turns out another thing, see, more evidence that I'm a failure as a clinician. And it just feeds itself, right? We've been conditioned to have almost like a dopamine rewards response for knowing the right answers, right? Like that comes out of our education system and a lot of how many of us were raised. So it's like getting 100% on the test. That's how you've derived your value throughout your life, is like, I was an A+, perfect GPA, all the awards. That's my value, is my achievement. And then you get into medicine where it's like, no one's giving you positive report cards. We don't even know everything there is to know about medicine. So it's impossible to have the answer 100% of the time. It's just genuinely impossible, right? And so then we feel like we miss out on our dopamine response we used to have. We're grasping for something to have instead. And we just feel horrible about ourselves because we don't have all the answers. And so then we feel anxious. That this is what leads patients with illness anxiety to be, I think, in some ways stigmatized, or, they're not always as well listened to, because we think that their illness anxiety is going to, we'd rather have patients who are calm and not afraid of illness, because then we don't have to deal with all the questions that they're asking us that we will fail to answer. it's important to just really know, like, that's about us. And the good thing about that is it's within our power then to heal this illness anxiety and address and comfort ourselves with our illness anxiety. And that first of all, then we don't feel terrible about ourselves all day long. And we're going to be able to be more effective with our patients who have illness anxiety and actually address it in ways that you should just see how it transforms conversations. Patients that I have dreaded seeing for years, now that I have this insight and awareness, I am starting to enjoy our visits. And they are, by the way, becoming less frequent. They feel more heard. They tell me they feel more heard. Like, it's fascinating how once I've let go of my own anxieties about needing to know the answer for patients, we think that's like the ultimate failure and then they'll like hate us forever. It's a relief for patients to know we're not hiding something from them, but actually we don't know either, and we're going to figure it out together. But I am still calm. I am still confident because I know I'm not supposed to have all the answers, but we're going to learn together what could be going on. It's a reassuring, secure place that we can be for our patients once we've created a reassuring, safe place within ourselves, right? I will say the one last thing that makes these kind of interactions challenging for us is that we are social creatures and like mirror neurons are real. So if someone presents with a very intense emotion in a room, like our instinct, we have an instinctual mirroring of that. You know, if you see someone and they're really sad, you might see tears come to your eyes, right? If you see someone who's really like just vibrating with anxiety, you're going to feel a little bit of those vibrations. So that's another piece of it as well. Like, and that's nothing to do with your responsibility as a practitioner. Like, that would be true in any room you were in, is like, you know, if you're a bit tuned in and empathetic to others, like you're going to feel a little bit of whatever emotional energy they have. But that's still not a problem in that, especially if you're aware that's what's happening, you're like, oh, here I go. They're really vibrating. I feel myself starting to get a little vibrating. Then you can use skills to process your emotions and ground yourself again and just be aware that that's going to happen in a room. I always like to think of like as what this is all about. Like if you think of a deer in a herd, you know, one of the deer starts to feel anxious because they're seeing something that might be a predator, and their ears perk up, and then you see all the other deers, like their ears perk up too, and they're not seeing the lion out there. They're just sensing, even, I don't know if they're seeing, but they're sensing that one of their family members is feeling more anxious. And doesn't that make sense evolutionarily? Like, that's how that whole herd survives, is because if one person suddenly has an emotional change, that is potential information that's useful for everyone else in that community, because what if there's a threat, right? So I don't even have to make that a problem. I can be aware that's happening. I'm like, oh, there I go, deer in the herd. I can then take some deep breaths and make sure that I'm creating space within myself to generate a sense of calm that I'm going to use to calm myself through this encounter, put on my best listening ears, and that I know can therefore actually be therapeutic and help ground and calm the other person as well. If I'm trying to manage by answering all their questions and shutting them up kind of energy, which is, I think, what a lot of us are kind of trained to do, is kind of like, stop talking. You're just trying to like make them stop and manage them out of their anxiety. Doesn't work so well. Now you're resisting their anxiety. And have you noticed how it doesn't work? Have you noticed that things just escalate in the room? You can try that if you want, but I have tried it. It was not successful. So those are some of, I just wanted to sort of list like where does our different aspects of our illness anxiety for our patients come from? So it's these societal conditioning messages that we've received, both like personally through our education and then baked into the medical culture, like all the medical legal stuff. And then there's actually the biological part where feelings are a little bit infectious, right? And then the last thing that makes illness anxiety potentially more challenging when we see it in our patients is that like a patient with intense illness anxiety can generate more work for us, potentially, right? They want to come in more often. They report more symptoms. They feel them more intensely. You know, they're going to emerge a million times, and you, because of your, you know, cultural conditioning, feel that you're responsible for that. They make more urgent requests for tests. They might be calling your staff every day. When's my test? When's my test? Right? Asking a lot more questions. And whatever questions they ask you, have you noticed that those with illness anxiety are really less likely to feel reassured, even if you have like a totally amazing evidence-based answer? Like finally they ask a question, like, oh my gosh, I finally know the answer to this. And you give them a whole spiel and they kind of look at you like, yeah, okay, but what about this other thing? Like that's how you know. These are just some of those things. Okay, we know we're dealing with illness anxiety. They're not like genuine questions in that because when you are in full anxiety mode, like thinking of our patients for a minute, when they're in full anxiety mode, it's full survival brain. And survival brain is not learning brain. Survival brain is, I am in danger, please help. And so they are just like putting out alert signals and they're not even listening probably to the answers. So that's why all of your beautiful, well-reasoned responses are likely not working for your patients with illness anxiety, right? Like it's because it's not actually about the question. It's about their feeling that they're going to die and they're terrified of dying. They're feeling that they're going to be in pain and they're terrified of being in pain. Like it's the feeling level that you got to meet them at if you actually want to create some space and distance and some support for them, right? So yeah, that's all of those are the reasons why we struggle so much. That's like, those are the reasons I could think of that we struggle so much with our patients with illness anxiety. And for all of those reasons, that's why we really have to start by addressing and tending to our own illness anxieties with these patients. These are patients that really you can't just like, well, you could sort of half ass your visit and like half listen. You know how you can do that sometimes. Someone comes in, it's a cold, it's straightforward. You kind of go through your visit. You already are like pre-populating your documentation because you like know what the answer is going to be. That's not going to work for these patients. These patients are usually like a full brain experience. And so we've got to actually make sure that we have our full brains on board, which means we need to offer ourselves the calm and compassion for ourselves in order to get into a state where we can do our best listening and our best boundary setting with these patients as well. Like I said, we can be a source of grounding calm for these patients. When we do that slowly over time, as we gain their trust, we can offer them a safe place to reflect on the role of their fear of disease and how that's playing into their experience of disease. That's been the coolest thing. So I will say my own experiences, I started to notice, why are these patients my heart sink patients? I'm putting that in quotes, right? Why do I really dread and feel terrible about these patients? They're coming in a lot. They're peppering me with questions. What is going on with me? What are my underlying inhuman stories, my belief systems that are causing me to personalize what this person is bringing to me? And I did that work for a while. And then once I got to that clearer place where I was like going in and saying, okay, my job here is to listen. My job here is to validate. My job here is to just be a safe container for them to express their concerns to me. Then I started to find ways to actually speak to them that allowed them to have more insight into their illness anxiety. So it started with me, like for a while, I was mostly just trying to remain neutral in the room, and that was already still better. They were calmer. But then over time, as I felt like more confident with that, then I started asking a bit more probing questions. And sometimes they'd be like, nope, it's not about my feelings. I tried and I did trial and error to see what would work. And I have come with a few strategies now that patients walk away thinking, oh, yes, I can see the connection between my emotions and my physical health, and not in a way where I feel dismissed by my clinician, but actually she listened to me enough that I'm making that connection for myself. And I feel more empowered to understand that the more that I care for my anxiety, the more I will feel better, even physically. Right. So that's like, now I'm kind of at this state where I'm doing that more with patients, and you will be surprised. Like there are patients who've come, it's the first time I've seen them for this issue. When I listen to this story, I'm like, okay, I can hear there's some anxiety, emotional component. Like at least a part of this is how their emotions are manifesting in their body. There may also be some other like pathological illness as well, but I can hear that. And I kind of like talk them through it. I had one patient recently by the end, she's like, you know what? I actually think I know exactly why I now feel anxious about this symptom. It's because of what this other person said to me recently, and now it's really spinning. And like she had that insight all on her own. And we still actually ordered some tests just in case, whatever, do a little something. But like really, she actually got her answer just in that one encounter with me. And so that's what I want to offer to all of you. As this podcast is closing out, first, I want to offer you some of the things I tell myself that's allowed me to get into that more neutral space. So I am not feeling as much anxiety about their illness in the room. And that is step number 1 through 5. Okay. Like that is like the most important thing. If you never think of the other tips I'm going to give you for what you could say to them, like ignore the tips to say to them until you have first really digested and understood and reflected on the ways that your anxieties are showing up in the room with the patient. You are that other human in the room, and it always starts with you, right? So first, what are some of the things I've understood and repeated to myself? Like some of these thoughts I'm about to offer you, I would like write. I have a reminders app on my phone, and I would like put them as like the headline that I would see on my lock screen on my phone or on sticky notes to remind myself. And I would, especially with those patients that I know repeatedly, it's like an illness anxiety bonanza when I go in with them, and they always ask for 50 million tests, right? I really make sure before I enter that room, I like spend just a few minutes reading some of these intentions, taking some deep breaths, doing some like grounding exercises in my body before I step into the room. And that really makes all the difference, honestly. So here's some of the things that I repeat and remind myself. I don't need to know any of the answers. I just need to understand and connect with this person's current experience. And like the short form of that is like understand and connect, understand and connect. I find that those two, for me, those two phrases are very useful. Understand. So then I'm not immediately trying to assume things. My job is to be this inquisitive scientist in the room and saying, tell me more about your experience and connecting with them. It creates a whole different dynamic than the old dynamic where I was sort of performing that I knew everything in the room and was just trying to like make sure I was doing like a tap dance in the room to make sure that they didn't realize that I had no idea what I was doing. There's not a lot of understanding and connecting when you are just trying to perform that you're a good enough doctor. Just to say. And so what if you took that hat completely off? We're not even trying to be a good enough doctor. We're just trying to be a human with another human, asking them questions, connecting with them, and then seeing what you have to offer them in terms of knowledge you do have. It's a whole different orientation. It makes a huge difference. Another thing you could say to yourself is, I am safe and okay no matter what my patient is feeling. Just so you know, all of these, I always have an episode outline that is sort of my notes that I'm reading off of as I do my podcast. And so if you're hearing some of these and you want to remember them for later, you can always check out that episode outline and you can find those ones and then, save them for yourselves. But that's another one I find. Just reminding myself I'm safe and okay. There is no threat in the room. No matter what my patient is feeling, I am in charge of my own thoughts and my own feelings, right? And that's another way I say it is, my patient's feelings are their feelings. Their thoughts are their thoughts. I am over here having my own thoughts and feelings, and I can take care of me. In my group coaching and my one-on-one coaching, I do a lot of teaching where I literally draw like on a whiteboard the space between you and your patient, because a lot of times it feels like you're like fused together in these, especially in these encounters where you're just vibrating with anxiety off of each other. But if you can create space and say, I am over here and they are over there. This room has enough space in it for them to have their feelings and I get to have mine. And then speaking of those feelings, so if I'm getting anxious, I'm getting shamey, if I'm getting whatever in the room, something I repeat to myself is, I know how to feel these hard feelings. I feel them all the time. Because I do. And so it's so funny that we're so terrified of feeling these feelings that we literally feel every day and don't die from, right? So just a reminder myself, I know how to feel these hard feelings. And then the last one that I really loved, especially recently, just thinking to myself and repeating to others, repeating to my coaching clients, repeating to my residents that I teach is, It is safe for me to tell the truth and say, I don't know. It is actually so critical that we feel like we can say, I don't know to our patients, to our learners, to our family. We think there's a shame. It's a shameful story to say, I don't know. It is the most important thing we can say to ourselves and to others when we don't know, and just tell the truth instead of feeling like we have to lie and pretend we have an answer that we don't. It's very liberating, I'll tell you. So those are some of the ideas and phrases that I have used to just get myself into a place where I feel way more capable and confident and calm when I walk into a room with a patient with anxiety, illness anxiety in particular. And now I just want to share with you some of the questions and sort of phrases that I have found to be effective in speaking with them. Okay. Remember, there is actually no magic phrase, and I won't say I literally say exactly these things with each patient, but I just want to give you the flavor of how I speak to them. And just also then you can see what's possible once you get calm and confident, the kind of ways you could speak to your patient. And these ones I have found patients receptive to hearing. So the most basic, I learned it, first day of at least family medicine residency as a part of FIFE. So FIFE, just in case you didn't get the same training as me, FIFE stands for feelings, ideas, function, expectations. And it's sort of using a patient-centered clinical method, really asking the patient their experience of what's going on for them. And so specifically for illness anxiety, one I found helpful is, how do these symptoms make you feel? How are you feeling about having this nausea, this diarrhea, this chest pain happening? Like, and instead of only speaking to, when did it start? How is it, like sort of your classic OPQRST questions, which are also very useful. Trust me, it's a time saver. It's a connector. How are these symptoms making you feel will get you so much farther and understanding what the rest of the encounter is really going to be about. And then, especially if it's clear they are vibrating with anxiety, I will try and name it. So things like, do these symptoms worry you? What are you worried could be going on that's brought you in today? And just naming and normalizing worry by stating it. And sometimes people are like, oh, I'm not worried. It's just that my grandma and mom both had colon cancer. And so they'll say they're not worried. And that's fine, because people have different opinions about saying that. But like, it still opens up the same question. If they're like, oh, no, I'm not worried. It's just, and then they tell you why they're worried. It's really interesting how they do that. And same with me, by the way. So that's another good question. Another one is, do you notice that your symptoms improve when you are more relaxed or distracted? What do you think could be going on there? Sometimes the patient will, like, as they sort of share their story of their experience, they'll say, and I notice that, like, when I'm over here, then when I'm doing this thing, it's actually fine and I don't feel it at all. And when I do this other thing, then it makes it worse. And I'm like, always like, interesting. What do you think's going on there? But if they haven't brought that out, one thing you could ask that they might say yes or no to is, does it improve when you're more relaxed or distracted? Because that doesn't mean anything definitive. It's not the ultimate diagnostic criteria, but it's a useful insight tool for you and them to kind of get into, when you're emotionally feeling better, do you physically feel better? Do some of these symptoms go away? And when you're feeling really stressed, do some of these symptoms get worse? And just noticing there's a piece of that might be happening. It's not the full story, right? Some of the other things I say, kind of scripts I say, so our physical symptoms can have an impact on our mental health. And the opposite is also true. Our mental health can have an impact on our physical symptoms too. And I say kind of like what I just said, like, when you're stressed and your normal migraines are way more likely to happen or more intense, right? It doesn't mean that the migraines are all in your head. It means like our emotions influence our physical symptoms. They are an influencer. It's because everyone always gets defensive if they think that you're telling them that it's all your emotions, you have nothing physically going on. And the way that you can, and so this is a way of saying we are holding space for both. We're holding space for the emotional experience of your illness, as well as the physical potential underlying causes. And both of those things are actually always happening. Whatever it ends up being, both of those things are actually always happening. And so talking like this and leaving space so that they don't have to feel defensive when you bring up emotions, very useful. Another way I could say it sort of explicitly is, I understand and believe completely that your symptoms are real, and we are going to continue to check for any dangerous causes of these symptoms. I find that the dangerous causes versus like pathological, which is just a medical word, or real, no, we're not using real. Their symptoms are real. They're experiencing them. That means they're real, right? But I say dangerous cause because, dangerous as in life limiting, life altering. Dangerous is a word that they would understand. That is what their anxiety is telling them is going on, is something's dangerous. So we're looking for the dangerous causes. While we do these investigations, because I'm going to agree to do some investigations the vast majority of the time, unless it becomes very clear that there's no cause for investigations. A lot of times, at least, I don't know, simple blood work or something is often warranted, right? So we're going to do some investigations for sure. So you can like give that to them, like, okay, we're definitely going to do some investigations. So now you don't feel like you have to convince me this whole time. And, right, again, we're holding space for both. What do you think about also addressing how anxious you feel about your health so that you can actually start feeling better mentally right now? I say this to them, to a ton of patients. We don't have to wait to get that test for you to feel better. We can actually work on helping your anxiety about the situation feel better now, and we'll get the test to see what happens next, right? And so separating those two then makes them more open to the idea of addressing the anxiety itself. And then my last thing I wanted to say, it's my favorite phrase that I've discovered through my training, is instead of saying things are somatization or somatic, even though that's correct, they're feeling it in their bodies, but somatization, well, first of all, patients don't really know what that means. Or saying hypochondriac or something, patients really have a negative connotation of that. But I like to sort of just describe what's happening more accurately, which is medically unexplained symptoms. And actually, that's everything that every patient comes to us is a medically unexplained symptom. And then sometimes eventually, either in the room with the patient or through a test, we will have an explanation. And sometimes we won't have a full medical explanation in the classic way we think of medical explanation. A test won't say yes, right? And instead, it's more about us helping the patient come to an understanding of how their body works. And there won't be a treatment or a surgery that's going to take the symptom away, right? And so calling it sort of medically unexplained symptoms, I feel like it's a more neutral way of saying it. And it leaves room for the truth that we don't know everything about the human body yet. So say someone, what is, classic, like they've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which in some ways are medically unexplained symptoms, but also not, right? Like it depends on who you ask, or we kind of think of it that way, right? And so just saying like, we don't have a curative treatment for this, right? Still leaves space for ways that you can feel better, but we don't have a cure, right? And if you want even more language about how this relates to chronic pain, my episode that was released October 28th, 2022 was all about chronic pain and some of these other ways that we can talk about pain. And so I just wanted to point you to that as an additional resource as well. Okay, so those are my tips, both for how you first and foremost can address your own anxiety about your patient's illness. And then also I wanted to give you some helpful scripts and advice about what you can offer to your patients after you've done that initial grounding work. So my invitation for each of you who is listening, check in with yourself and ask, how does anxiety about illness show up for me in my personal life, at work, and with my patients? And what is one thing I'm going to try from this podcast to ease my own illness anxiety and create space to sit with my patient's illness anxiety? That's my invitation to you. It is possible. If nothing else, I suspect the phrase that will help a lot of you is, it is safe for me to tell the truth and say, I don't know. If that idea causes anxiety to you, that is work worth doing. And one place you can do that work actually is if you haven't already taken my free email course on how to stop worrying about your patients, I explain further like concepts and causes and a practical exercise that you can use to help you with this particular anxiety and worry that you have about your patients, which is that you need to have all the answers for your patients. And so you can find that course at joanchanmd.com/course. The link of it will also be in the show notes of this podcast. I talk about how I do this work on a deeper level, one-on-one with my coaching clients as well. All right, everybody. Illness is out there. The body gets sick. We are aware of that. And yet we get so tied up in little tangles thinking that we are meant to prevent all of it and have all the answers for all of it. And it so doesn't serve each of you in your work in healthcare. And it also doesn't actually serve your patients. And so why don't we find a different way to address illness anxiety? Take care.